Okay, I'm ready.
All right, let's go ahead and get started tonight. Dear Heavenly Father, again, we're so privileged to open your word to see what you have for us. Lord, tonight as we start a new study in a new book, I pray, God, that you will anoint your word as it goes out. Anoint my lips to say those things that you'd have said, and anoint our hearts to understand. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, tonight we're gonna start Ruth.
Okay.
And I'm looking at this probably being 3, maybe 4 weeks
Okay.
at the most, I think, and we'll be through with this. So I'm going to try to cover 2 chapters a week after tonight, because it's a story that's it's pretty easy to follow. And so what I'm going to try to do is to pick out those things in there that have some background and kind of help you understand a little bit about what's going on in the story. And then we'll try to apply some of this as we go along.
What's the date today?
All right, now Ruth, number 1, is a history book. It actually tells the story of Ruth, Naomi, Orpah, and then Naomi's, doesn't say much about her husband and 2 sons, but that's basically what the book is about. Now it's a book or a megalith, and it's one of 5 megalos that are included in the 3rd division, the Ketuvim of writings. Now I want you to put that down. You'll need it on the final test.
You've said 2 words already. I don't understand. What's the megala?
Yeah, what is
The Ketuvim, or writing, the one that it's in is the 3rd major section of the Tanakh, or the Holy Bible, Hebrew Holy Bible, the Tanakh.
What is a megillah or something?
Megala.
Megalith. Yeah, M-E-G-I-L-A-T-H, megalith.
What does that mean?
It's a scroll.
Oh, a scroll.
Now the 5 scrolls are the Song of Solomon, or Song of Songs,
Okay, so we
the
know.
Book of Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and the Book of Esther, along with Ruth. That makes up the 5 megalos. Now
Can
these
you
are,
repeat that again?
Yeah. Is it in here?
all right, they're the Song of Solomon, the Book of Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and the Book of Esther. Now it's interesting, these 5 books, all along with Ruth,
Oh, and
make up this 3rd section. And you kind of look at it and you wonder, why in the world would they put those together in that order? And I think we'd have to do some comparison studies to come up with that. But I think Esther and Ruth certainly would go together because they're both very similar. Although Esther is a little more, I won't say important because there's no book more important than the other. But Esther kind of talks more about the nation of Israel and its
hi there. Hi.
come on in. It's standing at the brink of annihilation under Haman, where the book of Ruth really takes place partly in Moab and partly in Judah, and it doesn't really affect anything until you get to the 7th chapter. And when we get to the 7th chapter, we find out that Ruth was counted in the lineage of Jesus Christ. And so that's an issue that we'll have to deal with because she was a Moabite. She wasn't Jewish. And so there's some interesting things that we can pull from this book. I think we can see what qualified her to be in that position. And then, anyway, we'll go along through that as we go. Now, we don't know who the author of the book is. Some people, some scholars, ascribe the book to Samuel. However, Ruth's identity as a non-Israelite, she was a Moabitess, and the stress on the need for an inclusive attitude towards strangers suggest an origin in the 5th century BC, when intermarriage had been controversial, as seen in Ezra 9:1 and Nehemiah 13:1. Now we know when the story took place, but who wrote it and when is up for conjecture. We don't really know that. Now there are a substantial number of scholars who date it to the Persian period, which was the 6th to the 4th centuries BC. The genealogy that concludes the book is believed to be a post-exilic priestly addition, as it adds nothing to the plot. Nevertheless, it is carefully crafted and integrates the book into the history of Israel, running from Genesis to Kings. Okay, so now we get all of the university stuff out of the way. As I said, be sure you have that ready for the final.
I'm going to front tonight.
One thing you will notice as we go through this book, whoever wrote it was a very skilled author and writer. The book is beautifully written. It's a love story. And yet it's very easy to follow, and is in some respects a little exciting to read through this and see what's going to happen. And of course, as a foreshadow of things to come, Ruth is a foreshadow of the church. And we will see as we go through how Ruth stands out as the perfect example of what we as Christians should be. Now the outline of the book, I put that in here for you. There's 17 breakouts in this particular outline. The first one is the introduction, and then there's Naomi returns, or this first introduction is Naomi emptied. And you'll see what we mean as we get through these. Naomi returns from Moab, Ruth clings to Naomi, and so forth. You can read through those and the chapters and verses that have those. So you can use this later if you'd like the videos or whatever, and you can see which one you want to look at. All right, let's start here with the book of Ruth. And we'll start with Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. And this is Naomi emptied. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled, so now we know when this story takes place, that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech. The name of his wife was Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion Ephrathis, of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died. So the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law. Or did we go? No, we're past. Okay, that's where we stopped. All right, so let's take just a quick synopsis here. There was a family in Bethlehem, and it was Elimelech, Naomi, Mahlon, and this Chilion. And as we'll see later, there's a good indication that they were, if not wealthy, at least probably landowners and well-known in the town, in the area. So they weren't just, some farm workers or something out there, They were well-known in the town, and evidently well-liked in the town of Bethlehem. Now, we've been to Bethlehem. We know what that town looks like, up in the mountains, and it was, of course, has always been primarily sheep or animals, but they also did a lot of barley and wheat farming in those days. So along came a famine. Why would there be a famine? Well, now this happened in the times of the judges. In the book of Judges, and read through, we find out that whenever Judah or Israel would serve God, they would prosper. Their crops would come in, and they were at peace with everyone around them. When they turned their back on God and started worshiping idols, then what would happen? The enemies would come in, and they'd wait till the harvest, and they would come in and they would take all the crops. And this was the basis for Gideon. If you remember the story of Gideon, when I think at that time it was the Philistines, I believe, who came in. One of their enemies came in and just ravaged and took all the crops, and that's when we find Gideon. He's not on the threshing floor where he should be. He's down behind the threshing floor, you know, threshing the wheat, you know, blowing the chaff off of the wheat so he could gather enough to live. Instead of being up on the threshing floor with the, you know, an animal that's threshing it out and throwing it in the air. No, they're back and hiding so the enemy wouldn't see them. Well, what happened then, of course, Judah, they didn't have any food because the enemies would come and take them. Now, other times, there would just be a famine. They turned their back on God. He'd turn off the spigot, no water, and that was that. Or whatever, and the crops wouldn't grow. So this was evidently one of those times. Now, I find it very interesting that this being a time when Judah had turned their backs on God, here was this family, and Elimelech decided that what he needed to do was he needed to go to Moab. Now this also is interesting because Moab was traditionally an enemy of Judah. However, it was kind of off on again depending on the need. There were times when Judah and Moab would form an alliance, and then that way they could stand up against enemies. And so when that happened, they were friends. But then along would come, you know, Israel would get more stuff, and so Moab would want it, and then they'd be enemies. So this also tells us that this was one of those times when Israel was at peace with Moab. So now, where's Moab? Moab is on the other side of the Dead Sea. Now remember, we were at the Dead Sea down at the south end. If we'd have gone on around into that, it's what's now Jordan. And it was right on the seashore of the Dead Sea. That was this land of Moab. Now, Moab were descendants of Shem, by the way, from Noah's ark. All right, so that's kind of the situation that they were living in. Now, it's interesting, I think, to note also the names that are given here. The man's name was Elimelech, which means, my God is king. My God is king. His wife was Naomi, which means my delight. And his two sons, Mahlon, meant sick, and Chilion, I'm going to get, I've been practicing this thing all day. Ephrathritis, there we go. Chilion Ephrathritis means ashiness or fruitfulness. Okay? So, if we look at these names, we get the idea that, because remember, names changed, okay, according to situations. And we'll see Naomi wanting to change her name a little bit later. So we see here that evidently Elimelech was a man of God. He said, my God is king. And we see Naomi meaning my delight. And this was from the view of God. She was considered the delight of God. Okay, as well as delight of people too, evidently, because we'll see what happens when she returns back. Now the sons are interesting. Mahlon means sick. So he was probably a sickly boy to start with. Not in good health. The other one means pining and yearning, wanting. And what was he wanting? He wanted he wanted fruitfulness. Always wanted to be fruitful. Well, this leads towards, in today's jargon, we would say the one was just a sickly kid who couldn't get in. The other one, he was wild. He was chasing all the girls, He wanted wives. He had this. That would be kind of what we would say today about them. So this was the family. And the Bible literally, when it says it went to Moab, meant to the fields of Moab. To the fields of Moab. So, after they arrived in Moab, they went there, now remember, they went there because there was a famine. And so they no doubt went to try to purchase or get food or perhaps work until the famine was over. But after they got there, Elimelech decided to stay there, evidently permanently. And so they just kind of set up shop there. It was probably very peaceful. And in Judah, every year the enemy was coming in. It was hectic. It was chaos. The nation refused to stay true to God. And it was going in and out. And as a man of God, it probably was driving him crazy. He'd just soon go on the other side of the lake and over there where it's peaceful and just not have to worry about it. Now, in some ways that's a good approach, but when we're talking about the things of God, running from trouble is not what God wants us to do. Saying, well, nobody wants to serve God, so I'm out of here. Yeah. Nobody wants to work for God, I'm out of here. Well, that's not what God wants. God wants us to stand up and change things. If we don't like the fact that nobody serves God, then what should we do about it? Change it. You see? And so instead of Elimelech changing or trying to change the situation, he ran to where it would be more comfortable. And how many people do that in churches? I mean, we can take it right down to that. I don't like this church anymore. I'm going to go over here where it's more comfortable. But, I've said it before, I will say it again. If you move or you change churches or you do anything without the will of God being involved, you're asking for trouble. And look at Elimelech. Here they go over there, and they seem to be doing really good. And Elimelech, of all things, up and dies. Now, that, of course, by itself, was Elimelech dying, was probably a big blow. But how did that affect Naomi? She was now a widow with 2 boys. Now, one thing I think, and of course you have to kind of read between the lines based on the names of these guys, but evidently Elimelech and Naomi were very, very, I won't say controlling, but very strict with their kids to make sure they toed the mark, because neither one of these kids seems to have gotten in problem. And you look at Chilion, you'd think he'd be out there, running around with all the Moabite women and having a big time. But we don't see that yet. There's no indication of that. So it's probably, they did a very good job of controlling their kids and keeping them where they should be and keeping them on mark with God. Okay, so Elimelech took care of his family. So he died. Now, what did Naomi decide to do? She could have returned to Bethlehem, where there was help. Her family, they were known there. So they could have returned and reaped some benefits from the nation of Judah, but she decided to stay in Moab. And so what happened, both of her sons went out and got married.
Right.
Now, I look at the two sons and I kind of sum them up this way, is one of them was sick and the other one was depressed. He wanted things he couldn't have, so I had to make him depressed, you know. So these were two really sharp characters here. I kind of read between the lines and I say these two boys were probably cream of the crop, you know, one sick, one depressed. But they went out and they found two Moabite women. Now Mahon, he wed Ruth, and Chilion wed Orpah. Now, some people have said, well, that was a sin right there. No, because the law did not bar the Jewish people from marrying the Moabites. It was not forbidden in the law. And a lot of people think, well, you know, they weren't, no, there was nothing in the law that forbid that. And the reason for that was that Moab was not part of the promised land. When they went into the promised land in Deuteronomy 23 and 3, Deuteronomy 23 and 3, one of the things that was, one of the laws that was given was that the Moabites could not be part of the congregation up till 10 generations. Now that wasn't the generation of the temple, or I mean the congregation of the temple. That meant they could not take out Judean citizenship, okay? They couldn't be part of the political nation of Judah. Now when Israel went into the land of into the promised land, there was the commandment from God, and I don't have it down here, but it's also in Deuteronomy, was that they were not to marry the inhabitants that they conquered.
What was that chapter?
Deuteronomy 23 and 3.
23.
So when Joshua took the children of Israel into the promised land, as they defeated the enemies, they were not to marry any of the existing people that lived in the promised land. Moab was outside of the promised land. So there was no prohibition against marrying them. It was just meant that they could not be part of the nation of Judah or Israel, either one. Okay? Now, according to Barnes, this law seemed to apply to the naturalization of citizenship rather than proselyting, just to make it very clear. Now, here they are. Now they've married and they've got these beautiful women and they're living with their mother. And in those days, of course, the boys took care of their mother. That's how she lived, was because of them. And that was part of the law. They had to take care of their widowed mother. And so I'm sure they were quite comfortable. Everything was going along fine for about 10 years. Now, I also note here that in 10 years' time, neither boy had any offspring. Neither one. One was sick, and the other one, he wanted it, but couldn't seem to get it. So for some reason, there were no children born in that family. After 10 years, well, what happens? Both brothers up and die. I mean, you know, you look at it and say, well, poor Naomi. Boy, you know, she loses her husband, now she loses both of her sons. The emotions of that, of course, would be tremendous. But aside from that, she lost her livelihood. Who was going to take care of her? Not only that, now she has two daughter-in-laws that also lost their livelihood. Who's going to take care of them? Now they were in Moab, and I'm sure Moab had laws concerning taking care of widows and so forth. But here, you know, in Israel, there were very, very specific laws into keeping widows, you know, taking care of them providing for their needs and so forth. And they weren't there. They were in Moab. So now they're up against a really hard situation. What do? You know, when people turn and go in directions that God didn't lead them to go, there always seems to be situations come up that will drive them back to the point that they left. I don't know how many times I've seen people say, oh, you know, I'm going to go over here because it's so much better. I'm going to go over here and I'm really going to do something. And before long, you find them right back where they started. Because if you didn't learn it the first time, when you go through something or, you know, he's going to send you through it again. He's going to put you right back to that spot and say, now let's see if you can do it right this time. And if you don't do it right, he's going to put you right back there and say, now let's see if you can do it right this time. And so now they have come to this point where Naomi has to make a decision. And the decision she makes is that she is going to go back to Bethlehem and she is going to then allow the nation of Judah and her town of Bethlehem, her friends, to take care of her according to law. So there was more here than just the emotions of losing fathers and sons, and that was great, I'm sure. But in addition to that, this was her livelihood as well as the two daughters. All right. So now we come to the point where Naomi returns from Moab. And this is found in Ruth 1, verses 6 to 22. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Therefore, she went out from the place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. So she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, Surely we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb, and they might be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight and should also bear sons, would you wait for them till they are grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, Entreat me not to leave you, or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me.
So beautiful.
When she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. Now the two of them went until they came to Bethlehem. And it happened when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was excited because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" But she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me Naomi? Since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me." So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Now they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. As you can see from the writing, this is a tremendous portion of Scripture, probably one of the most quoted that's in the Bible, these parts of it. But we have Naomi in Moab, and word came to her that God had restored himself to Judah, or had been restored to Judah, and the times of famine were over. So she decided to return to Bethlehem because she would be taken care of as a widow. Now the law required that the widow be taken care of, but there was no such provision in Moab, as far as we know. And probably certainly not for a stranger if somebody was not from Moab. Now there's a couple of things to notice here. First of all, Naomi started out and she had Ruth and Orpah with her as she started off to head back to Jerusalem. Now very probably when they reached the border of Judah, that's when Naomi decided to send her two daughter-in-laws home. The reason is because it was customary in a situation not necessarily exactly like this one, but if you had somebody and they were heading back, that you would take them to the border of their country or the border end of your country if you were from a different country. Just as a courtesy, you would go with them to the border, and then you would go home and they would go on their way in their own country. This was just, we do some of the similar things. We'll take a guest and escort them out to the car, that kind of a thing. And that's probably what we see here. It's easy to look at this and say, well, Naomi just changed her mind. But I don't think that was it at all. They escorted her. She was a single lady, and obviously from her own words, she was getting up in age. And so I'm sure they wanted to make sure she got safe passage through their country so that when she got to her own country, then it would be easier for her to find some help to get on home. So that's kind of what we have here. There was also probably or possibly in her decision the fact that the Moabites could not become citizens of Judah. Now, we don't see much in the Bible about what a citizen of Judah or rights they had. But when you think about it, they have a lot of rights, just like we do if you're a U.S. citizen. You have access to the courts. You have access to help when you need it and so forth. If you're not a citizen of Judah, did you have access to the courts and could you get help when you needed it? And the answer is no, just like it is here in the United States. I mean, there's an access to courts here, but not like if you're a U.S. citizen. We have certain rights that are unalienable rights. That's the way to put it. So she would not have those rights, or the two girls would not have those rights. They obviously had rights of their own in Moab. Moab, we look at these countries sometimes and we think they're all so heathenistic and they're just really out there bush people, but they were very highly civilized. You look at Persia as a good example. They were way ahead of everybody in the science, and the Magi's that came to Jesus came from Persia because they were scientifically so far ahead of everybody else. And yet they were, you know, when you look at the actions of some of their military people and stuff, you say they must have really been heathens. But really they weren't. They were very, you know, civilized people in most cases. And so I'm sure they had their own laws and citizenship and all the things that you could find in Judah. So it kind of made sense to have them stay in their own country and go back where they were. Also, you notice that Naomi says something here that I think is interesting. She says in verse 8, "Go return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me." Now you would think that they would say, go to return to your father's house. But the Moabites were semi-nomadic. Even we saw the nomads around Jerusalem. You know, they just go where the grass is, and they move their sheep. That was the way that the Moabites were. And so instead of having, well, they had cities obviously, but instead of living in cities, they lived, a lot of them, in tents and moved from place to place. Well, the structure of their tents, they would have one tent for the males and one tent for the females. So when Naomi said, go to the house of your mother, what she was saying was, you go to the tent of your mother. Because that was a place of security. That was the place where the women felt comfortable, they felt safe. The men were in their tent, and they were, I mean, it's not like they were on the opposite side, they were together. So the men could form a defense if somebody came to attack, you know. But this was just their custom and in Moab. So she was telling them, you go to the comfortable place with your mother, where you're used to being. Now, that doesn't mean that their fathers were dead. Now, some people have said, well, I had to go to their mothers because their fathers were dead. So these poor women now, they don't have any fathers, they don't have any husbands, you know. Well, that's not it at all. I'm sure their fathers were probably fine. But we find something out about these two. Because Naomi, she pronounces a blessing on them. And that blessing is based on the fact that she asked God to treat them with the same kindness that they had shown to not only the dead. Now there were 3 dead, Elimelech and Molon. Anyway, now whether they knew Elimelech or not, we don't know. They may have been acquainted because he died before they were married. But certainly to the 2 sons. And this seems to indicate that they were very, very kind-hearted people. Both of the women. We think about Ruth, but what about Orpah? We don't think much about Orpah. She's put in the same bucket here. She's given the same blessing. I don't think Naomi had a preference of one girl over the other. They were both kind. They treated her and her 2 sons with kindness. Now, I want you to stop and think a minute. These were Moabite girls. And here you have some refugees that came into the country trying to find some food, all right? And how did these girls treat them? I would think it would be very easy to, you know, to kind of have a snotty attitude. Well, you come up here to get food, you know, hey, well, I'll give you a little food, you know. But they didn't. They had this wonderful kindness about them that stuck out to the point that Naomi asked God, bless them with that same kindness that they've shown us. When we show kindness, when we show our Christian love, then we can expect God to show His love toward us. What did he say? What's the greatest commandment that Jesus gave?
Love one another.
That you love one another. And here we see this very thing being played out in this very short story of Ruth and Naomi. And it wasn't just kindness, as we'll see in a minute. Now, both of these two seem to have the same traits and treated Naomi the same. There was a genuine love between them. I think the girls loved each other as well as they loved Naomi. Now, you notice that when they came to the border, that they kissed each other, and then they all wept. Now, kissing, some people get the wrong idea here, but this was a sign in those days of either hello or goodbye. It's kind of like, you go to Hawaii and it's, what is it, aloha, aloha, hello, aloha, goodbye. Well, there you would kiss them on each cheek, and it was the inside kiss thing. And so when you met them, you would kiss them on each cheek. That was a sign of saying you're welcome. And then when they would leave, you would kiss them on each cheek. That was a sign that they were leaving, and everything's fine. And so when they went through this little ceremony, I guess you'd call it a ceremony, of kissing each other on the cheek, then they begin to cry. And that's typical. I mean, you see people today, especially ladies, seem very emotional, and so when they're saying goodbye, they cry. But there was also this idea that they would never see each other again. This may be the last time that they see Naomi. She was up in age. It's going to take her a while to get home. She had to walk a few days. Would they ever see her again? I don't know if that's what got to them or what, but both girls, and I think it's important here to notice that both of them asked Naomi if they could go with her. We talk about Ruth, but look at Orpah also wanted to go with Ruth. Mm-hmm. So the first initial emotional response was, don't leave without us, we're going to go with you. We're going to go all the way with you.
Yeah.
And Naomi's response is really, you can kind of get the idea, but her response was actually to cite the Levirate law. And that Levirate law is from the Latin levar, or a husband's brother. And it was part of the law of Moses. In the name of an ancient custom ordained by Moses, by which when an Israelite died without issue, without children, excuse me, his surviving brother was required to marry the widow, so as to continue his brother's family through the son that might be born of that union or that marriage. And that's in Genesis 38 and 8 is where you find the Levirate law. Also Deuteronomy 25, 5 to 10. Now the object of this law was to raise up seed to the departed brother. Now this was not the redeeming kinsman. That's a different law, and we'll get into that in another chapter or two here. The Levirate vow, or the Levirate law, could not be broken. If you had a brother, he died without children, you were required by law to marry his wife and try to have children. Now that was an offense. You could be put in jail if you didn't do that. You could be fined, whatever. Sometimes you may say, my brother didn't make very good decisions on wives. I don't know that I want to do that. That didn't matter. It wasn't the point. This was a way to assure that his seed would be carried on. All right? And this was well-known law. And many of the countries adopted that same principle, that same idea, because they were so dependent upon genealogy. You had to have a male son so that the genealogy would continue on and all of it. It was all put together into this idea. And so what Naomi was telling the girls, she says, I'm old. I'm too old to have kids. Now I'm sure she knew the story of Abraham and Sarah. So she says, I'm too old to have kids, but even if I could, if I found a husband tonight, got married, got pregnant, kids, would you wait for them to grow up so you could marry them? Yeah, they might, but by the time those kids get grown, how old would they be?
Yeah.
I mean, when you really start putting this together, you start seeing the enormity of what she's trying to tell them. It isn't going to work. Even if I have more kids, I don't have any more children. You got the two of them, and I can't produce any more fast enough to take care of the Levirate law. So what are we going to do?
The Levirate lost.
Yeah, that's a problem. So what she was afraid of is that Ruth and Orpah would suffer the fate of not having children. And if they followed her, they would be in a land where it was a disgrace to not have children. You remember the story of Samuel's mom, She was barren. What did she do? She went into the temple and she was so concerned that they thought she was drunk.
Yeah.
Asking God for a son. Eli says, get out of here, you're drunk. You should be in here in the temple drunk. What's the matter with you? But it was just that she was so concerned about not having children. Mm-hmm. And so this, and John's mother also, the same thing, she was barren. So this whole idea within the Judea culture was that you needed to have children, and preferably male children. If you did not, you were considered disgraced. So what you also knew is if these two girls followed her back to Judah, they would be going into a place where they would be considered disgraced. And they would have to live with that. Mm. All right. And now we come to the big one. What did Naomi do? What almost everybody does. She blamed God.
Yeah.
God's fault. Don't follow me down there because God has turned his back on me. God, he just, it's all God's fault. Mm-hmm. Isn't that what people do? It's God's fault. Hey, my son died of a drug overdose. That's God's fault. You hear them, oh, my son was in a gun battle with his gang and got, and that's God's fault. No, it's not God's fault. Don't blame God for everything. God doesn't do those kinds of things. He may allow those things to happen, but they happen because you take yourself out from the protective cover of God. Don't blame God when you do that. That's as bad as if you walked out yesterday during one of those rain bursts out here that we had and walked around and carried your umbrella all folded up and then said, it's God's fault that I'm soaking wet. Not God's fault. Put your umbrella up. And Naomi and Elimelech decided to leave Judah to go to Moab and stay there. That's not God's fault. I'm sure they did a lot of fasting and prayer before they decided to leave. We learn here that there is that principle that when you turn your back on God, He's going to take you back where you should have been. When you make bad decisions, I should say turn your back, but you make bad decisions, He's going to take you right back to that point where you made that decision, and you're going to have to go through it again. If you don't die in the process someplace like these guys did. But don't blame God. It's not God's fault. No. All right. So then what happened? She's trying to convince them to go home to their parents and stay there. So what did they do again? They had another weeping session. Another crying session. And then Orpah kissed Naomi goodbye and went home. Now here is where we see the difference in the two women. Orpah, when she counted the costs, reminds me of the rich young ruler came to Jesus. I want to be your follower. Hey, can I follow you, Jesus? Man, yeah. Hey, I'm ready to go follow you wherever you go. I want to be one of your disciples. And when Jesus turned around and said, well, it's going to cost you. You go get rid of everything you have, give it to the poor, you can come follow me. He couldn't do it. See, he had a desire, but the desire wasn't strong enough to get him to make the sacrifices that needed to be made to follow Jesus. When Orpah counted the costs, man, yeah, I see what she's talking about. Man, yeah, I'm going to be a widow down there, and they're going to I'm not going to be able to make it, and man, I've got a future here. I can probably find another husband, and she decided to go back home. And some people look at the world around them after they've been saved, and they start getting into understanding a little thing about being persecuted, and I don't think we have real persecution really, but it appears to be that way sometimes. And it's just so much easier to go back where I was. It's just so much easier. And also, when Naomi, when she went out there and pronounced that blessing on them, in verse 9, she said, the Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. Saying is that I'm asking God that you find husbands. Now, Orpah probably took that into account, because she knew and she had watched Elimelech and Naomi all these years. They were, and I believe they lived, we would call holy and righteous lives. I don't think they did anything, because their boys didn't get wild, and you don't see any wildness. It's all peace and calm. I believe they lived the life that they were expected to live. And so Naomi had seen, probably answered prayers and understood a little bit about who God was. And she said, well, if Naomi's asking for me to have a God of my people, God will probably, a husband of my people, God will probably grant that. I'd be more comfortable with a Moabite husband, and here where I know everybody, yeah, this is the way to go. And so she turned around and she went home. Notice that Orpah kissed Naomi, but Ruth clung to her or stayed close to her. She weighed the same information that Orpah did. But when it came down, right down to it, her love for Naomi was greater than her love for her own comforts. Even immediacy, when you think about it, they had a long journey to make. They're going to walk a long ways to get up to Bethlehem. Bethlehem is just south of Jerusalem. And they're still on the south end of the Dead Sea. And they're going to have to go up along the Dead Sea. Then they're going to have to go up in the mountains in that beautiful country we were in with all the wonderful brown sand and hot sun. And it is harvest time, which means the end of the heat, the hot season. And they're going to have to make that trip on foot. I mean, to me, that would almost be the game changer. I'm going home. I'm not going to make that trip. But Naomi said, I am going to go with, Ruth said, I am going to go with Naomi. My desire is to stay with you. And so Naomi again tried to get her to go. She said in verse 15, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. That little word, back to her gods, tells me a lot. I think that both of these girls had been won over to Judaism. They were probably proselytes at this point. Been studying Judaism, probably under Elimelech and under Naomi and under their husbands for 10 years. They had gone through the training. They'd gone through the discipleship, if you will, classes, and they knew what Judaism was all about, and they were probably worshiping Jehovah. But notice what Naomi said. And this, this tells me something about Naomi. That while I'm sure she was very happy to have these girls as proselyte Jews and, worshiping God, when it came right down to the rubber hitting the road, what did she say? You see your sister, she's gone back to her people and to her gods. You do the same. I don't want to have to worry about you long term. Just get it over with now. You go on back to your own gods. Even though she was devout, there was not the feeling that God, Jehovah God, was really much better than their gods. You ever see that before? I would think that she would say she's going back to her people and unfortunately to her own gods, but if you go back, don't go back to their gods. That's what we'd say, right? Maybe she would have said, it might be better for you to go with me so you can stay with God. But Naomi was willing to put their personal comfort above their relationship with God. And how often do we do that in the church? We're more concerned with the personal comfort and allowing people to, let their own gods rule, and they worship their own gods that they set up. Whether it's football or whether it's sport cars or whatever it is, they're more, it's okay. God takes second place because this is important. I see it with kids, especially when they get to be teenagers. But you don't understand. This is the only time in their life when they're going to get to do this, and it's so important that we need to focus on this while they're here. And then along comes college, when they go off to college. And then what do you hear? Don't understand it. They were such godly kids, and now look at them.
Yeah.
Gee, could it be that you didn't put enough importance on what it really means to serve God? To put Him first? Well, we can't come. Sunday night is out. My kids have to get up early to go to school. Bosh. I'm sorry, you're talking to the wrong person. I was in church 5 nights a week, usually till after midnight, That was church every night for us, 5 nights. We were off on Mondays and Saturdays usually. Otherwise, I was there. It may not have been a service, it was a choir practice, or it was something else. 5 nights a week, and I still managed to get up in the morning and go to school. In fact, I managed to get up in the morning and go early to school so I can conduct Youth for Christ meetings in the mornings. Was I a weirdo? Yeah, I guess. I carried my Bible too, by the way. But I still found time for sports. I was still in football. I was still in track. I still found time to be in music. I played in the band. I was in the orchestra. I was in everything I could get into in music. And you know what? I turned out pretty good. It didn't kill me. And I did learn something. Evidently somewhere in there I learned something, you know. But people are so afraid their kids are going to lose out on something. You don't lose out on anything putting God first. He just multiplies the opportunities. Yeah. I know kids who you know, I'm football. I'm going to be up morning football. I'm going to work hard. I got to go to bed early. I can't make it to church, and I can't be there on Sunday because we got a football practice. And they make it through a couple of years of football, and then that's the end of it. They lose interest. It's not there anymore. Had a grandson, race car driver. At 15, he was wiping all the adults out in what is it, the sprint car racing. Won every race. They didn't even want to race against him. He's 14, 15 years old. He had to have a special permit to race because you're supposed to be 16. I mean, man, he had his whole career in front of him. They were looking at him from NASCAR. These drivers were watching him. He'd go back to Indianapolis and race. And they'd watch him, you know, oh yeah, we're marking this kid. And all of a sudden one day it's just, no one doing it anymore. That was that. But they put everything into that. That was important. That was the most important thing in that family. I was over there the other day, and they got a portable, one of these metal portable sheds, you know. And I remember when we set it up, we had some stuff we put in there for them. I was helping them. And I just opened the doors to see what was in there. That thing is packed front to back. It's one of these 10 by 10s. Nothing but trophies. Big trophies, little trophies, all from his racing. Not interested anymore. All of that time, effort, money. You see, if they'd have put God first,
Yeah.
it would have paid dividends. And so we see here that Naomi's attitude about God was very flippant. She wanted to blame God for everything. She never thought she was responsible for anything. And by the way, if you want to go back to your own gods, that's perfectly all right. I understand. But does God understand? All right, so here's Ruth. Again, what's the decision? What am I going to do? And notice Ruth's, and I don't see where she took any time. I really like this. She no sooner said, go back and return after your sister-in-law, but Ruth said. It didn't say Ruth thought about it. It doesn't start a whole new thing and say, now this is what Ruth said. It says, but. That tells me immediacy. Naomi no sooner got it out of her mouth that you go follow your sister-in-law, but Ruth said, entreat me not to leave you. Stop trying to get me to go back. Stop that. I don't want to go back there. You don't understand. Stop trying to plead with me to go back to my family, or to turn back from following after you. I want to follow you. I want to go where you go. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. This sounds like somebody that really understood what it meant to love God. She really understood what was going on in the Hebrew religion and understanding. This little Moabite girl had far more knowledge and understanding of what it meant to serve God than Naomi did. She makes a vow, she makes a pledge. Wherever you go, I'm going to go. Doesn't matter. You want to go up in the heat, you want to walk up in those hills back to Bethlehem, let's go. You want to go on up someplace, Jerusalem, let's go. Wherever you go, just remember, I'm going to be right behind you. I'm going to be right there. Wherever you stop and sleep, I'm going to stop and sleep with you. If you decide to stop before you get to Jerusalem and move into one of those other towns, well, that's fine with me. I'm just going to go where you want me to go. And you dictate that by where you go, because where you go is where I'm going. Oh, and by the way, your people. Now, I may not be able to be a citizen of Judah, but your people are going to be my people. I am going to consider your people as my people. Oh, and by the way, as it comes to Jehovah, Yahweh, your God, is going to be my Yahweh, my God. This is the attitude that God wants to see in every Christian. Once we understand God and we understand His relationship to us, it has to be a situation that says, God, where you want me to go, hey, let's go. If you want me over there, let's go. Doesn't matter. Wherever you want me to move and stay, I'll lodge there. You just show me the way and we're going. Yes, sir. And by the way, they're going to be my people. Wherever I'm at, I'm going to embrace the Christian community, the body of Christ. They're going to be my people. And I'm going to be integrated. I want to be in that number. I want to be working with them. That doesn't mean that we just come to church. That means they become family. We become concerned about each other. We work together. We get things done. Oh, and of course, God, you're going to be my God. You're going to be my provider. Oh, wait a minute now. That's getting a little too far out. I'll follow God, and I'll if He wants me over there and I can sell my car and house fast enough or whatever, then I'll go there. But don't ask me to make you my provider. Because you don't understand, God. I went to college for all these years. And I have all these degrees, and I have plans for my life, and I can make money, and or I want to be the realtor and flip houses, and I've researched it, and God, you got to understand, I can take care of myself. I don't need you to take care of me. That's not what God wants. He doesn't want you or us or Christians as a whole to rely on their own understanding. He said, rely not on your own understanding, but do what? Rely on Him. He'll use our skills, He'll use our understanding, but we cannot rely on Him. If we say, God, I'm going to follow you, that doesn't mean that I'm tired of living in this town, and I think it's time for me to move out of here. She'll tell you, I don't know how many times I said, I got to move out of this state. It's driving me nuts. This liberal, all this. I mean, I got to get out of here. That place is driving me crazy. But I can't leave because God hasn't told me to leave. I've had people say, are you going to leave the church too? I said, just a minute. Text from God telling me to leave yet. I'm here until He tells me to leave.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter where I go, really. God will take care of me.
That's right.
And He'll make it the way it should be. Mm-hmm. And at my age, I anticipate He'll make it rather comfortable for me. The temperature just right. He won't send me to Alaska, hopefully, or someplace. He could send me to Latvia. Now, that would be wonderful. I'd love to go there. But the point here is that Naomi understood. And she said, wherever you go, that's where I'll be. And your God's going to be my God. Now notice verse 17. I think this really is what puts the the cream on the top. She says, where you die, I will die. And there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts you and me.
But that's love, isn't it?
What's that?
That's love.
Yes. But it isn't a love that was short-term.
That was for eternity.
She could have said, I'm going to follow you until you die,
Right.
and then I'm going home. She could have said, I'll follow you until you get settled in and everything's going smooth, and then I'm going to go home. No. She said, I'm going to go with you until you die, and where you die, I'm going to stay there until I die. And I'm going to be buried in that same place. That is what you call long-term commitment. Long-term. Because Ruth wasn't very old at this point. She'd been married for 10 years. And in those days, they married at around 14 to 15 years old. So she was probably 24, 25 years old. She was not an older lady. She was still a kid, really. But it doesn't matter, Ruth, if you live to be 104, I'll be right there. And I can be buried where you are. And then notice what she says. If I don't do any of these things, make it worse on me and then some. God, if I don't follow through, then you have free rein to do to me whatever you want. Even kill me. Now that's a commitment. That's a commitment. Notice after she saw that, verse 18, when Naomi saw that Ruth was so determined, she stopped talking about it. Now, it doesn't say she quit talking to Ruth. It looks like she just shut up and they didn't say anything else till they got back down. And I've heard preachers talk about that. That isn't what's meant here. It means that she stopped trying to get her to go home.
Right, yeah.
I give up. All right, you win. Come on, let's go. And they headed out. Now, when they got to Bethlehem, and this is why I say that Naomi was probably well-to-do, or at least very popular in the town. Notice what happened when they got there. When they came to Bethlehem, in verse 19, now the two of them went until they came to Bethlehem, and it happened when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was excited because of them, and the women said, is this Naomi? Now she'd been gone at least 10 years, probably closer to 15 or so. And so, it's been a while since she was there. Is this Naomi? The whole town, it doesn't say a few, it says the whole town was excited. Wow, Naomi's come back. They almost had a party. And notice what Naomi says. Verse 20. Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara. Since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me. Yeah. Mara means bitterness.
Oh.
Bitterness. What she was saying was that she was bitter. Now we see the real crux of the matter with Naomi. She was bitter. God, you took my husband. God, you took my sons. You've left me with nothing. I mean, you know, I can understand the feeling. But didn't she ever look around and see Naomi? I don't know, if I had a daughter-in-law, I mean Ruth, I'm sorry, Ruth. If I had a daughter-in-law, she has to keep me straight. Who knows what I'll call them next. Like Ruth, I would consider myself blessed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, here's this Moabite gal who's willing to go to the ends of the earth for me. That should have made her feel so elated, because she had no reason to do that. She had absolutely no reason to love Naomi to that extent. Naomi already admitted she had absolutely nothing to offer her. But isn't that what God, isn't that the kind of devotion that God loves to see? You know, I heard people say, well, you know, you shouldn't expect anything from God. In one sense, that's true. Our love for Him should not be dependent upon what He gives us or what He can give us. We should love Him simply because we love Him, of who He is. And we should love Him because of what He has past done for us. Died on the cross, resurrected, we have everlasting life, or can have everlasting life. That should be more than enough for us to be absolutely devoted to Him. But yet there are those who will love God as long as they give them. He gives them something. He keeps blessing them. And those are the ones that you see their life this way. When God blesses them, oh, they're on top of the mountain. Oh, God is so good. You know, wow. And the next thing you know, you talk to them and they don't even come to church. Well, I'm busy. I'll go over that. Yeah. Down in the dumps. And then something will spark them and they'll start up a little bit. Pretty soon you'll see them back at church. Oh, yeah, hi, brother. Oh, man, God's good. The next thing you're down in the valley again. Because they react to what God does for them. When God is blessing them, they're on top of the mountain. When God pulls back His blessings and expects them to stay on top of the mountain, that's the learning exercises. That's how you learn to be consistent with God. Love Him on the valley as well as you love Him on the mountaintop, then the next thing you'll know is the valleys don't get so low, because you learned your lesson the last time, and so it's a little easier. It just works that way. All right. So she didn't want to be called Naomi. She changed her name, wants to be called Mara. Verse 21, I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Really? Empty? What about Ruth?
Yeah.
Did your two boys hold you in that high esteem as she does?
Mm.
Did they treat you like she does? Or did you have to whack them upside the head every once in a while to get them to even talk to you? You know, that's kids, you know, as they're raising up. Sometimes even when they're grown, you got to just smack them one to get them to even admit you're here.
Yeah, it's true.
Voice of experience.
Think you're old.
Notice verse 22.
Think you're old.
So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Now they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. And this is important as we go through the story, that this is the beginning of the barley harvest. And of course the barley is what they use to make bread. And that's it for tonight. Anybody have questions?
But I enjoyed it.
Very informative.
Yeah.